Hi everyone, welcome back to It's a Lot, Let's Talk. I'm Kylie.
I'm JP.
So we've talked a lot about systems in the past and the unpaid caregiver, but systems don't actually deliver care. People do. So what that looks like is personal support workers, registered practical nurses, and registered nurses in the home, because truly they are at the core of the system. And the system matters, but it only works because the people inside of it.
Yeah, and when you look at systems, systems have a lot of different parts. And as you said, one of those major components or major parts are the practitioners themselves, the PSWs, the RPNs, and the RNs. And that's really critical for the system. Yet, there may be, an attitude out there that they're not as important as they should be. They may be spoken about and said, yeah, they're so important, the practitioners and so forth, but are they truly? And I think what we're going to explore today is whether or not that's true or not. And we can look to existing practices, from agencies, from different models that are propping up. PSWs, for example, work in hospitals, they work in long-term care homes, they work in homes. How does that differ across those different venues? And RPNs and RNs, nurses in general. What does society, how does society look at them in terms of, what they do and how they contribute and how important they are and so forth. So yeah, of course it's the system. We always blame the system, but within that system, there's components that we got to focus on. And I think one of the key ones, as you mentioned, was the practitioners themselves. So I look forward to this conversation and kind of exploring that a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. I think one of the biggest topics of discussion would be practitioners in the home go beyond clinical skills. So when a practitioner is working in the hospital, it's very clinical. Um, there's a lot of clinical aspects to it, and there is also bedside manner, but it's so different when you're in the home. Um, there's so many other aspects you have to look at, like home safety, emotional regulation, how the client is doing, how the unpaid caregiver is doing as well. When you're going into someone's home, it's very vulnerable for them. So, clinical skills, yes, are amazing in the home, and obviously you need them, but it goes way beyond clinical skills.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have a recent example. My daughter's going to be graduating from nursing school. So we're in what, 2026, and my wife is also a nurse who graduated, over 20 years ago. And I think the focus in those nursing programs are still on clinical, of course, they have to be, but they're also realizing that there's more to nursing than just clinical aspects. And one could even in Canada, we have kind of two systems, or we used to have two systems, the college system and the university system. And those two delivery mechanisms were a lot different, whereas the university is much more on clinical and leadership and administrative, where the college was on practical application of those clinical skills. So two different or two divergent kind of approaches to training the same type of nurse. But like you say, it's more than just the clinical, especially when it comes to home care. You could almost argue that in a hospital as well. In more acute areas of the hospital, clinical is really important. More chronic, you have a combination of those clinical skills, but also it's more reflective of what could happen in the home where you have ongoing care and so forth. And, skills have to be conjured up and conjured up. Why did I mean conjured up? You know what I mean? Applied. Skills have to be applied to various different situations, not just on the clinical side. But you're absolutely right. Self-regulation you mentioned, and those types of things are skills that, need to be inputted. And the question becomes, if this is the case, and our nurses and PSWs are having to go through this formal educational process, how much attention is paid to that? We kind of have an understanding. Is it just glossed over? Is it in depth and so forth? I could speak to my daughter's experience and where she went to school. There was discussion of these different things from a leadership perspective, from a holistic, patient-centered perspective. So there is. But I think sometimes what happens in those formal programs is that students get so hung up on the clinical side because typically that's much more demanding in terms of their attention, in terms of their time and so forth, that they sometimes don't put as much emphasis on those other skills. So, I see in a perfect world, if you kind of have these hard clinical skills that they have to learn, and that's the most challenging to learn, you almost have to separate it from those softer skills, those engaging skills, those emotional intelligence skills, those self-regulation skills. So there can be an emphasis and an understanding that, yeah, these are, I don't want to say as important, but on the same level as those clinical skills.
Mhm.
And you come from the home care agency world, the traditional model. What was your experience in bringing on board practitioners in terms of the balance between their clinical skills and their soft skills?
It's a good question. I think obviously just speaking to people and hearing their experiences, it gives you somewhat of an idea of what their clinical versus soft skills would be, but you never really know until, well, I don't know if you ever really know. It's like I wasn't in the community overlooking the PSWs every day. I wasn't standing beside them to know, right? So, what ha actually happens in the home, who knows? You just have to trust that you've found a good practitioner based off of obviously their qualifications and having conversations with them. So it is really it's it it's difficult to tell, right? And then you have to go based off client feedback and family feedback. Um, and I guess you just have to trust that you've done your due diligence to vet them properly. Obviously, there's situations that are unfortunate, and we never want to run into that. But um, I think mostly it would just be through those interviews that you hold and having conversations and asking the right questions to get to know their soft skills, but also are they able to obviously perform the
Right.
clinical side of things? But I am curious, your daughter, how much time, maybe you don't know the answer to this question, but how much time do they actually spend in her program focusing on the community side of nursing? Because I would imagine it would be very clinical. Do they
Mhm.
spend a good chunk of time on the community side of it? Do you know?
Well, just in conversations with my daughter and kind of talking about that, I know they have a number of different types of placements throughout the program. It depends on what program, what university you're going to, and so
Right.
forth. But I know her last placement will be a community placement. So
Right.
they do focus on that kind of aspect, going out into the community, working in the homes, not just necessarily with seniors, but all type of, caregiving kind of
Mhm.
situations. And I think that's really important. Now, in her instance, she's already gone through an interview with a hospital, and that focused a lot on the clinical side of things. But it
Mhm.
did focus on, and you kind of spoke to it as well. In the interview, there's a lot of situational behavioral type questions. And coming from an HR background, I know the best predictor of future performance is past experience. But
Mhm.
if you're talking about a new graduate, it's sometimes difficult to kind of understand that, explore that, at least from the clinical side. However, from the soft skills side, somebody doesn't have to work as a nurse or a PSW to understand where they're coming from with regards to, for example, reading a room. Uh, you
Right.
know, and then we know in home care, family dynamics is really important. There's a lot of transferable skills that we pick up in our personal lives, that we pick up in past jobs that we have, and so forth. And I think that's the beauty of it, and perhaps sometimes overlooked. Now, I
Mhm.
haven't sat in on an interview for a nurse at a hospital, but I would think, and I would hope that they would kind of explore that aspect of it. Okay, here, what are your clinical experiences, if any? And what are some experiences that you've had where you had to read the room or you had to understand when a customer came in and what that dynamic was going to be and what was your approach and so forth? And you could kind of transfer that over into a home care situation when a practitioner goes into a home and they see the patient and they kind of understand and they go through their assessment or their observation or whatever it may be, but then they have to deal with the parent, the parent, I should say, the child or the caregiver or the family, whatever that may be, and that takes a different type of skill set than it
Absolutely.
does from the clinical side, and I think that's really important. What other skills have you kind of identified that were really critical to the role as a practitioner in the system?
I think. Honestly, I think the biggest thing is getting into it for the right reasons. Um, it takes a special kind of person to want to be a nurse and a PSW, in my opinion. So finding that person who is in it for the right reasons and not necessarily just because it's a job. Oftentimes I've found some people will try to join the field or they are already in the field, but um, because the nature of the game is it's I don't want to say it's cutthroat, but I'll speak to PSWs specifically. These PSWs are the hardest working people I have ever spoken to. And people can say what they want about PSWs. I will ride for them because truly they are just trying to put food on the table for their families. They're trying to keep a roof over their head. So they're taking long shifts and they want these long shifts. So they could go and they could work a 12-hour day. And I'm not saying this is right, especially speaking to someone with an HR background. I'm not saying this is right, but this is what I've noticed the patterns is they'll work a 12-hour shift and then they'll go and work a 12-hour night shift. And
Mm, mm,
it's tough.
mm,
Obviously, morally, ethically, you don't want to be providing care to someone when you're tired and exhausted, but oftentimes on these 12-hour night shifts, there's chances for you to sleep. Um,
mm,
Again, I don't want to get into that side of things. I
mm,
don't fully agree with it, but I'm just saying this is the way that it goes. So these people are out here working hard and they're dedicated to their jobs, and for whatever motivator they have, that's what you like to see, the motivation behind it. That skill is the self-motivation, or it could be internal or external, but that just seems to be what I've noticed. I
mm,
think everybody is different, and I've noticed different skills, obviously, from different people. And not one person is going to have all of those skills. It's almost like discovering what that person's skill is, highlighting it, and then if they need assistance in the other areas, you obviously have to work with them on building those skills to complement their other skills that obviously they
yeah.
are good at, the reason they're there in the first place. So it is tough to pinpoint just one other skill.
Mhm.
I think the biggest would be having care.
Right, right. And and you're speaking to the reality of what's going on out there, right?
Yeah,
In the community with, individuals trying to make a living and so forth. From a system perspective, that's a definite failure. That shouldn't be happening if you
absolutely.
design a system. And from a labor law perspective, obviously there's some questions there. And I think in terms of the skill sets, if we think about employers today, just in general, even outside, the healthcare arena, you look at adaptability to change, right? Change is always happening, and where does change happen more frequently than in a home care situation or a healthcare situation, right? So being able to adapt to change is really critical. You got problem solving. Where else than home care or in a hospital setting or in a long-term care do you have problems kind of always occurring and being able to deal with that? The ability to build trust, quickly with somebody obviously is key. But I think, but if you step back from the individual and you look at the system as a whole and you identify the practitioner as really core to that system, if the system is broken, it impacts each of those parts within that system, and the practitioners being a huge part of that. So you may have practitioners like a PSW who's probably making minimum wage at best, maybe a little more than that, working back-to-back shifts. In a good system, in a strong system, that would never happen. But for
Right.
some reason, it exists. That's the reality. So we know the system is broken for sure. And we often place why that system is broken on the backs of the practitioners when in fact they're only part of the system, right? Very important part. And they take the brunt of the blame for that. Oh, this PSWs are terrible, or they're lazy, or we generalize, and so forth. And you right off the bat say, hey, these are the hardest working people I know, generally speaking, right? They're committed. You don't go into taking care of somebody because, hey, you just want to make a buck, because you would do something else other than going into home care to do that. Probably a place where you can get tips at least, for your good effort and so forth. So they're there more for, just making minimum wage or just about that. They have a passion for it. They feel they want to contribute to society. And I tend to look on the more positive sides of individuals, and I agree with you. I think, they're there for a good reason. Where it breaks down is when the system breaks down. So
Absolutely.
separating the system from the practitioners is often difficult to do, but understanding the practitioner's plight is easier when you understand what's breaking down in the system. And when you have back-to-back shifts or scheduling issues or not getting enough shifts, so it's
Mhm.
forcing practitioners like the PSW to scramble 4 shifts, forcing them to do back-to-back and so forth. That's a broken system. But we're not here to talk about the broken system. We're here to talk about practitioners and what it means. Talk to me more about, or talk to us more about, um, the specialized realities in home care
Mhm.
and how, practitioners need to be in tune with the different types of situations that help happen in the homes and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's many specialties you can get into in home care, and we obviously encourage you to educate yourself on these when you're going into a home because there's so many different situations you can walk into. Because no home is the same. Your neighbors are so different from you. So I think the biggest specialized care would obviously be dementia care. It's huge. Dementia can be so
Unfortunately.
unpredictable. So it takes a special type of person and care to be able to handle those situations. You have to be confident, but you also have to be empathetic and have patience, and you have to be able to de-escalate a situation or redirect. You really have to be on the balls of your feet when you're dealing with dementia specialized care because, like I said, it's so unpredictable. But there's also more predictable specialized care like fall risks. You have to be aware of your surroundings at all times. Is the home safe? When I leave my shift today, is the client going to trip over a cord? Like you have to have prevention in or like a prevention mindset, but also aware in the moment. And obviously situations happen when you're not always present, but you need to set up the situation as best as you can before you leave. There's also hospital discharges. That would be a specialized pathway. Um, there's so much uncertainty around hospital discharges, like we've sort of touched on in the past. Um, do the clients or the patients, are they going to go the route of home care? Are they going to go the route of long-term care? Are they okay, manageable on their own? How's the family doing? How is the family coping with this? There's so many aspects around discharge planning that we don't always see. So that is definitely a specialized pathway or specialized um, care route. I don't know what I'm trying to say there, but you know what I mean.
Yep.
And then there's also end of life support, which is huge. There's so many different aspects to end of life care or palliative care that people don't necessarily understand because it is a very heavy, unfortunate side of care, of life, really, because it's inevitable. End of life is going to happen. Now, does that happen with dignity? That's the goal. So end of life support is really just trying to provide dignity in dying.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
that in itself is so complex that it's so specialized that I
Right,
couldn't even tell you everything involved in end of life support.
right,
So,
right.
working in these uncontrolled environments is a whole different ballgame than clinical skills. And all of
Absolutely.
these specialized skills, imagine, and I would like to think or hope and look for a practitioner having a lot of these specialized skills.
Hmm.
Um, and most of them already do, whether they have a certificate for it or not. They've seen a lot in these homes.
Hmm.
Whether it's to the extent of end of life support, probably, if somebody's at the point of home care, if you're with them or if the practitioner has been working with this client for a long period of time, obviously, uh, they might see some end of life start to happen. But having a lot of these specialized care routes, sorry, I'm rambling now, but a lot of
No,
these
no.
specialized um, situations or skills is important.
Yeah.
Whether they have them or all or not is another question, but you do like to look for them
Yeah.
for sure.
And we definitely know, I see it all the time. I've have a lived experience in terms of my mother going through Alzheimer's and so forth. A lot of home care agencies will claim they have these specializations, but in reality, do they really do? And I think from a systems perspective, not every situation is the same and requires different ability, different skill sets, like you talked about, and so forth. And so, making sure practitioners are specialized in the area that they're actually involved in is key. We see that in hospitals, for example, the GI suite versus, surgical floor or whatever it may be. But do we see it in home care? Because obviously the environment's a lot predictable. It's kind of dynamic. Things are changing all the time. So in essence, home care requires a different skill level, a much I would say, dare I say, a higher skill level than in a structured kind of clinical setting where, hey, I'm focusing on this type of patient. Unless you're at a smaller hospital and it's more generic and more open and so forth. Whereas in the home care, it's dynamic, it's always changing, got to adapt on the fly, and that's what we were talking about, the skill sets that are required outside of the clinical side, for these practitioners. So huge kind of part of the system as a whole. The learning curve on these, and I could take it from personal experience, no clinical background at all, zero clinical background. So I kind of speak out of the side from an HR perspective. When I was working with my mom, I'll give you a perfect example, just being aware, she would
Mhm.
say something that was out to left field, and I would correct her. And I know over time that one, just through observation and experience, what's the point of correcting her?
It's easier to
Rather than
meet her
going with the
reality,
flow.
yeah.
Yeah, and somebody who is well versed in dementia care would know that right from the get-go. So there is a learning curve and there is an experience. It all depends how the system supports that individual, especially when they're entering for the first time, right? So
Yeah.
agencies say we offer dementia care. I wonder how well trained those individuals that are providing that dementia care are actually doing it. And
I
and
will
I think, that leads to, the question how practitioners are treated today. Like how are they treated in our system?
Right. I would like to go back to what you're saying about agencies, and I do want to say that when they offer these specialized care pathways, I do think that they have these specialized care pathways. I will stand on that. It's whether or not the client has access to those practitioners who are specialized. And it gets tricky when you're talking continuity of care because, for example, let's say, let's hypothetically, let's say someone's mom is sort of starting to decline, but there's no signs of dementia yet. So they want to get a practitioner in to care for mom, spend some time with her throughout the day. But then down the line, you have this practitioner who has spent a lot of time with this mom. She's all of a sudden diagnosed with early signs of dementia. Now, this practitioner might not necessarily have these dementia specialized care courses or certifications, but what they do have is this connection with this mother who they've been with for a long period of time and they can recognize their patterns. Now, on paper, they don't have dementia care specialization. So then it becomes this like toss up for the family of do we now want to switch practitioners for my mom who has had this connection with her PSW, or do we want to stay with this PSW who knows my mom well and knows her patterns while she was in her right state or before she was diagnosed with dementia? So I think that becomes tricky when you're saying, like, do these home care agencies actually have specialized?
Well, I think that's a great example of where the system breaks down. You can't blame the practitioner.
Exactly.
If the system knows that, there's a potential of a client going in this direction health-wise, and we're trying to our goal is to work towards continuity of care, which I absolutely agree. I with my own mother. Anticipating that is so we're not saying they started with, you're not going to put somebody that doesn't have dementia care background with somebody who is already diagnosed with dementia. You're going to put somebody with that qualification. However, if you put somebody that doesn't have dementia, but they're at the start of their senior journey, and that's a potentiality, the system in any HR workforce development system would prepare that practitioner for that potential inevitability. And that's where you're taking a practitioner and giving them the option or the opportunity to acquire this skill set. But if you go
Absolutely.
into home care, like you mentioned, dementia, post-hospital discharge, falls in the home, et cetera, that's part of the game, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
PSW programs cover this all the way. So the system is where it's breaking down, not the individual practitioner. And that leads me to the next kind of thing. And I've asked you, how are practitioners treated within the system?
Uh, I'm not a practitioner, but I'll speak on what I've seen working in a home care agency is not great. I don't think that they are treated the way that they deserve. Um, like I've said earlier in this episode, is these are some of the hardest working individuals I've ever met, and they are really dedicated to their job. For whatever reason that is, they are the hardest working, strongest people I've ever encountered. And that's not to discredit any other field, but I do think that they don't get enough credit for what they do. It is so hard to walk into someone's home and look at them and understand their emotional intelligence, understand the dynamic of their home, understand their children, whether that's their daughter, their son, but then also their children's spouses and their grandkids. And they have to know every aspect of these people's lives. One person's life isn't just this one person's life, it's so many other people involved, ideally, for the right person. Hopefully, they
Mhm.
have a good support system. But there's
Right,
so many dynamics, there's so much going on inside this home that they don't get credit for. And then on top of it, they're paid minimum wage.
right, right.
Like
Challenging.
it has to be, like I said, I've never been in their situation. I've never been a practitioner myself, but it must be so draining to show up every day and have to be at your 100 and provide the best possible care that you can, and then go to bed at night knowing you worked so hard, maybe not receiving the credit you deserve in the community,
Mm-hmm.
and then getting paid minimum wage to wake up the next morning and do it all again,
Right,
on top of having to handle your own life.
right. Yeah,
So,
challenging. Beyond, for sure.
yeah, and that goes for PSWs, but that also goes for nurses as well. Like you said, in the community, sure, or in society, everybody says, "Oh, nurses are truly the heroes of our communities." Absolutely. I stand with that. But then you have these people inside the community who aren't actually giving them the respect they deserve. And when I say these people inside the community, I mean the system.
Right, right,
Because they are also very hardworking and they have these skills, emotional or soft skills, but also clinical skills.
right.
And I mean, they just don't. The biggest thing, I guess, is the respect, and they don't get the pay that they deserve, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And from an HR perspective, if you think, and I think this is the irony of it, if you look at a typical entry level position within an organization, a traditional job where you show up at the office, you clock in at 9, well, you don't clock in, you show up at 9 and you leave at 5. Organizations are putting mechanisms in place that support the employee, i.e., they're trying to encourage or foster psychological safety, which we know now is an important variable in determining whether or not somebody feels that they're free to express themselves, that it's a safe place to go to, they're committed to it, and so forth. In the home care environment, you don't. It's more precarious in nature. of to employment than other situations. Even though we have PSWs full time working in long-term care homes, we have some PSWs in hospital settings, but many of the PSW works in home care, which we know is precarious, meaning that they're not guaranteed kind of steady schedule of shifts. And they may be, not saying they don't, but a lot of them don't. And, they work, like you said, back to back shifts and so forth. So, it is a challenging environment. We talk about shortages in Ontario, Canada, of PSWs, of nurses. And why is that? The question is, why is there a shortage? Because, it's potentially because how they're treated, not in a purposeful way, right? Maybe maybe in terms of what we pay them, right? And we pay, they're being paid a certain wage, call it minimum wage or just above minimum wage, because that's what the system can support. So we know the system's broken in that
Right.
respect. But it's not a traditional way of, supporting an employee by making sure they're psychologically safe, that they have access to resources, that, they have a predictable schedule of work days and those types of things. That in above and beyond the job itself is a challenging thing. And I think that's a reflection of whether we consciously, society I'm speaking about, or the system, consciously or unconsciously are treating them in a very poor way. They are the core to the system. And I know we weren't talking about systems, but they are the core. If it wasn't for the practitioners, the system would collapse if it's not already collapsing. And if you want to fix the system, right, you first need to look at the practitioner and how they're treated and how we can treat them better. Because I truly believe, and we've had conversations about this, I truly believe that if you treat them in a way that's in keeping with what value they bring, quality care is going to improve. It's just common sense. We don't even have to like look at science
Yeah.
or look at experience and so it's just common sense.
Right.
Um, so yeah, we can. I think maybe we're going to need another podcast on this
Yeah.
because there's a lot to kind of dissect, and we just scratched
Yeah.
the surface on this, but a lot more to talk about for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna ask what you think that what it looks like to you to treat the practitioners better. How, like ideally, how should they
Yeah.
be treated in order to keep them in the field?
Yeah, I think one is pay them what they deserve,
Hmm.
whatever that number is, and I think it's a lot more than they're getting paid now, especially within community care, right?
Hmm.
It's not near on par with the hospitals or long-term care, so that's number one. Number two, give them options or choice in terms of how they want to work, when they want to work, who they want to work with, and so forth. I think that's absolutely critical. And the last thing is provide them support not only on the job but development perspective. If we know the system knows that somebody's going to has a high potentiality of leading towards dementia, provide them within a creative way of training them on how to deal with dementia patients, as an example. So
Hmm.
those three things, I think, if we look at that, it starts to one improve the delivery of care for the practitioner self, but most importantly, it provides them with the sense that I'm being valued, I'm being developed, and I have a way of contributing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that care at home entirely depends on practitioners. And if they're supported, ideally the system stabilizes because truly they are the system. They're not a part of the system, they are the system. So supporting them through that and finding these little changes and tweaks that obviously the system needs that we've talking about so much is the best way that we can support these practitioners. And I think that's a good direction that we're headed ourselves with care at home.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Excellent.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like you said, we'll definitely dive deeper into this topic in the future. But I think we'll leave it here for now. So, um, JP, unless you have anything else to say,
No, great discussion. I
amazing.
enjoyed it.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for listening today and joining us on It's a Lot. Let's talk. Thanks for joining us for this episode of It's a Lot. Let's talk. If this conversation resonated with you, we'd love for you to share it with someone in your network, whether that's a colleague, a caregiver, or anyone navigating care at home. Be sure to follow us for more conversations like this, where we unpack the realities behind care and the people who make it happen every day. And if you have thoughts, experiences, or perspectives you want to share, We want to hear from you because these conversations don't end here. Thanks again for listening.